Hey, it's Ryan out here on Mille Lacs Lake enjoying another beautiful spring day. As you can see behind me, that's Hennepin Island. It's covered in birds and ice right now. It's kind of a shell of its former self. Just a few days ago, it was piled up probably 30 foot tall with ice on it, but we've been having some nice days, a little bit of rain, some warm winds, and it has really melted down. That being said, the water is still very, very cold. And that's going to bring me to what I would consider to be one of the most overlooked cold water techniques for smallmouth bass. And that is the blade bait, if you can see it right there. Blade baits, maybe I'm not giving enough credit to fishermen by saying that, because what's new on Mille Lacs this year, or all of Minnesota, is the year-round bass season. In past years, we have only been able to fish from opening day onward, which was somewhere around mid-May. But this year, we can start fishing as soon as the ice goes off. I think you could have ice fished for smallmouth too, but that's not something I really do. But to get back to what I was saying about maybe it's not fair to the fishermen, in the past, the only time you would encounter water temps as cold as we have right now was late in the fall, right before ice up. And a lot of times, that's pretty nasty weather that late in the season. When water temps get down into the low 40s and upper 30s, you're really at the bitter end of things. That's usually getting right up to Thanksgiving out here on Mille Lacs Lake. So not a lot of people get to fish in water this cold until this year. So the blade bait, it's always been a staple for late season anglers. It's kind of the last thing you reuse right before ice up. It's definitely a November bait. It can catch fish year round, but it is really at home when water temps are in the 30s and 40s. Now, why does the blade bait work so well at this time? I'm not really sure, but I think a lot of the reason is simply because you can get down to the fish and you can keep it in front of their nose, unlike a lot of other baits. For whatever reason, when it gets super cold, I don't have as much luck on the dragging baits, whether it be a tube or a Ned rig, that sort of thing. Usually what I'm using when water is in that upper 30s, lower 40-degree range, I'm using something that's swimming, something that represents more of a minnow than a crawfish. And I don't know if that's just because the crawfish go dormant, the crayfish go dormant at that time, or what the deal is really. You would think dragging something on the bottom would be just ideal. You can slow it down as slow as you want to go. But for whatever reason, I just haven't had as much luck on those type of baits when the water gets that cold. Baits that do have potential, like swim baits and jerk baits, they can work well in cold water fish. But when it gets super cold, down in the low 40s and 30s, what you notice is the fish tend to move out deeper. So whether it's fall or whether it's spring, you're going to find a lot of the smallmouth out in deep water. A lot of times it's going to be 20 plus feet of water. With a swim bait, you can still catch those fish. Swim baits work great late in the fall and early in the spring, right at ice out like we have right now. But sometimes even the lightest jig head on a swim bait, even crawling it just off of the bottom, super slow, just really doesn't turn them on. It's more of an enticing bait, and you're dealing with a fish that is extremely sluggish and just not really willing to chase. What I think the blade bait has over a swim bait is you're not really trying to entice the fish so much, is it's popping up in front of them. It piques your curiosity, it drops to the bottom, and it provokes a reaction. When you fish it right, you're only lifting that bait probably a foot and a half off the bottom. And that's where the fish are at this time. They're really tight to the bottom. You rarely see them come up very high. And that's one of the reasons why the jerk bait doesn't work as well when it gets super cold. Even though they're interested in it and you can watch them on the sonar following the jerkbait, even if the jerkbait's 10 feet above their head, you'll see them following it along the bottom, but they just won't come off the bottom and they just won't commit to it. Now, you might say, I'll just throw a deeper jerkbait. can be kind of tough to find something that actually gets that deep that they want to bite. A lot of jerk baits that you find kind of top out at 7 to 9 feet. So getting something down 22, 24 feet, even 18 feet is really difficult, and it's just not something that I have in my arsenal. The blade bait, however, does just that. It gets down deep, it gets right on their nose, it hops off the bottom, and it falls back down. There's something about bass and a bait dropping right in front of their nose that just, it gets their attention. It's not just the lift, but it's also the fall. A lot of times with the blade bait, what you find is the lift is what brings them in, the fall is what gets them to bite. Nearly all of your bites on a blade bait will come on the fall. Usually what happens is you flutter it up off the bottom, you let it fall down, and the next time you go to lift it, there's a fish there. Usually they don't crack it when you're lifting it, but if they do, I mean, it with cold hands, it feels like it's gonna pull the rod right out of your hands. With blade baits, I like to keep it pretty simple. My selection is pretty darn basic. I don't grab a ton of different baits for this. I started fishing blade baits probably 20 years ago, fishing walleyes on the river, and we just go to the tackle shop and get like these $2 or $3 blade baits. Sometimes if you found stuff in a package, it would be like head and sonars, but the ones that I liked back then were the ones that came with treble hooks on them, not the double hooks, but definitely you wanted the ones with treble hooks and split rings. The problem is when you find blade baits with those double hooks on them where the hook is split in half, don't really know how to describe it, but the hook is like bent in half and then they thread the hook through the metal on the blade. Those ones lose a lot of fish. The fish get leverage on those hooks. You have one less hook down there, actually two less because there's two sets of trebles. On those, they have two sets of doubles. But you have less hooks, and once you do hook up fish with them, the fish can get a lot of leverage on that hook on the bait, and you lose a lot of fish on them. So I like to go with the old school blade baits that just have the treble hooks with split rings on them. Those are the ones that definitely are going to put more fish in the boat when you get bit. The other thing is I'm almost always using a 1/2 ounce when fishing a blade bait. Sometimes you can find like 3/8 and 1/4 ounce blade baits. In my opinion, that's for really shallow stuff. Like when I used to fish the river, that was something that you would pitch up in like maybe 3 to 6 feet of water. I'm almost exclusively using 1/2 ounce baits. I know some guys out east that fish the Great Lakes, they'll go all the way up to 3/4. But the 1/2 ounce seems to do anything I need to do on Mille Lacs. Generally, when I'm fishing this technique, I'm anywhere from, at the shallowest, about maybe 8 to 12 feet of water, but usually it's like 18, 20, 22, maybe 24 feet of water. The 1/2 ounce does great out in those depths. If I do find fish with it up shallower, the 1/2 ounce still works great. It hasn't seemed to cost me any bites. So I just stick with the 1/2 ounce. I keep colors extremely simple. I either go with gold or silver. For the most part, I just use gold. That's what I'm used to using, but I have both just in case for whatever reason I think it might make a difference that day, which it probably doesn't. But I have two colors, gold and silver. I have a box full of different colors. When I used to fish the river a lot, you know, I had fire tigers and chartreuses and whites and blues and purples and all sorts of things from years ago. But the two colors that I go through are going to be 1/2 ounce gold, 1/2 ounce silver. Get them with the split rings and treble hooks. You don't need to go out and spend a ton of money on these baits. Just pay attention when you buy one. Get the old school simple ones. They work really well. Maybe if you have a suggestion for a blade bait for me, I'm open to suggestions. You can always leave me a suggestion on something. But the old school ones, they catch fish, they work. They've been working for 50 plus years. Guys have been catching fish all over the country on them. There's a lot of companies that make good ones out there. The ones that I've been buying are either the Sure Sets or the Bee Fishing. Either one of those have been fine. And the other thing is, for $5 or $6 a piece, when you lose them, they're not going to break the bank and they catch fish excellent. The setup that I use is just a 7-foot medium fast rod. You don't need a fancy rod to do this. The sensitivity is nice on a higher end rod, but it's not really necessary. Blade baits produce a lot of thump What I generally do is I use braided lines, so you'll feel it with any rod you use, but I use braided 10-pound line on a spinning rod with a 10-pound fluorocarbon leader. You want to go a little bit heavier on your leader because when you're fishing the blade baits, what tends to happen is you're fishing around rock or rock sand transitions, and there's a ton of zebra mussels down there. And if you go any lighter than about a 10-pound leader, you're just going to run into a lot of issues with abrasion and lost baits, and at times lost fish, just because you get nicks in your line. It's just the nature of how you're fishing it. You're popping it up off the bottom, letting it fall down around rocks. Your line's dragging across all those zebra mussels. So it takes a bit of punishment, your leader line does. So 10-pound is definitely, I wouldn't go any lighter than that. And check your line often, because bringing it through the rocks, a lot of times you'll bring it back to the boat and you'll find some major nicks in it. If you go with 10-pound for your leader material, what you'll notice is it can handle a couple small nicks and still get that fish into the boat. And part of the reason why it'll still get them into the boat, even with nicks in it, brings me to my next point, and that's setting the drag. I usually run a pretty light drag. I don't want a heavy drag because I'm using treble hooks. I'm not necessarily getting a great hook set on these fish. With the treble hooks, you generally don't want to give much of a hook set. When you lift, you feel the fish and you kind of lean into them. Give just a little wrist snap. If you start cracking on them, what you're going to do is just break lines, and it just seems to not hook the fish as well. So when they bite, when you go to lift that bait up and you feel a fish on there, just give them a little snap of the wrist to set the hook, but don't crack them like you would a worm or something like that. The other thing with the light drag is, since you're using treble hooks, a lot of times these fish are just going to be skin hooked. You don't get a lot of meat at times with treble hooks. What I have found is when you back off on the drag, even when they're just skin hooked by the lip, you can still get them into the boat. If you try cinching it down and bringing them up faster, a lot of times they're able to pull free, and the lighter drag just, at the end of the day, just puts more fish in the boat. Now, casting the blade baits can be a little bit tricky. There's two headaches with fishing blade baits. One is zebra mussels. You get a lot of zebra mussels out here on Mille Lacs. You're using trebles, you're pulling around rocks or rock sand transitions, and you're dragging it up the edge of these rocks, and you're snagging zebra mussels all the time. The one thing you can do is, when you feel the vibration of the blade, which I'll get into in just a second here, but when you feel that vibration of the blade disappear when you go to lift it up, if it just comes back, you know, kind of limp, what you want to do is just give it a good hard pop. Sometimes giving it one good hard pop is enough to shake free those kind of the older zebra mussel shells that you run into quite a bit. It'll help you about 50% of the time. The other half the time, you just have to reel it back to the boat, pull the zebra mussels off by hand or slap the water with the bait, and then chuck it back out there. The second headache with the blade baits is going to be casting them. And it's not so much on a calm day like we have today. You can cast these things a country mile if you want to. But what happens on a windier day is, if you're trying to cast them into the wind, sometimes the blade will tumble. There's a couple ways you can mitigate that. One is, I like to kind of throw it underhand or sidearm. What I'm trying to do is make a nice smooth cast to get that blade to go straight out there and fall in the water straight down. If you try to whip it out there, a lot of times what'll happen is that bait will tumble and those treble hooks will wrap over your line, and it's a wasted cast. If you go to make that first lift with your rod tip and you feel that the bait is dead, might as well just reel it back in. What's happened is the line has got around that rear treble and it's just a wasted cast. So try to make a nice smooth cast. Or the second way to cast it out is, if you're casting it directly into a stiff breeze, what you want to do is give it a good hard cast, but then towards the end of the cast, grab your line. So I like to use spinning reels for this technique. A lot of times we're fishing in pretty windy conditions. The spinning reels, you have less backlashes, less headaches when you're casting into the wind. But when you cast it out there, take your other hand and just kind of use it as a brake to stop the line. before that bait slows down at the end of the cast. Give it a stiff cast, slow it down right before the end. That'll keep the bait straight for you. It's a little more fumbling around, but it works. The technique itself is pretty straightforward. I really only fish it one way myself. It's not like we have a long portion of the season to do this, so I don't do a lot of experimenting with it. It's usually, you know, just going to be a few days at the beginning of the season and a few days, maybe a week or so at the end of the season when this bait really shines. So it's not something that I play with all season and try a variety of different techniques with it, but my experience doing it on other lakes has always been kind of one way works best with this. And what I generally do is I cast it out, make just a medium length cast. I'm not trying to bomb it as far as it'll go. I just make a medium length cast. That way I can feel what's going on the rod tip. It's really important that you're able to feel that bait. You want to know exactly what it's doing down there. You want to know when it's hit the bottom, and you want to know when you're lifting up when it starts to vibrate. So what you do is you cast it out, let it sink to the bottom. Once it hits to the bottom, you want to just make like little 1 foot pulls with your rod tip. You're not trying to jerk it. You're not trying to rip these baits. Some of them in the past have been called Zippo baits. And I think what that has done is it's led people to believe that you're supposed to crank on these things and lift them 4 feet off the bottom and drop them back down. And while that may catch fish some places, in this cold water out here on Mille Lacs, like we have right now, right at ice out or at the very end of the fishing season, is those fish aren't going to come up 3-4 feet to chase that bait. They're just not going to do it. They're sticking really tight to the bottom. They're within a foot and a half of the bottom. They're actually kind of hard to see on your electronics because they're so tight to the bottom and they're not really willing to come up at all. So what you want to do is lift that bait just a foot and a half off the bottom and just get the blade to flutter. You're not trying to make it zip real hard. You're not trying to really engage it and get it going. You're just trying to get the bait to do it. Just 2, 3, 4 flutters off the bottom. You just want to feel your rod tip go bump, 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 bump. That's all you want it to do. Any more than that, and you're going to overwork the bait and you're going to catch less fish. It's just the way it is. Typically what I do is I cast it out, let it sink to the bottom, lift it, bump, 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 about a foot and a half, and then I let it fall on tight line. You can just drop the rod tip and let it go on slack line, but I try to keep it on tight line because I don't want that bait potentially rolling over and tangling in the line. The other thing it does by keeping a tight line when you let it down is it's hanging for just a little extra time. It's giving those fish just that extra little second to try to catch that bait before it hits the bottom, because they're eating it on the fall. They're not eating it 99% of the time. They're going to eat it when it's dropping. They're not going to eat it when you're lifting. When you're working this bait, another thing that's really important is work it all the way back to the boat. A lot of techniques, what you do is you cast it out, and if you don't have a fish, you know, within 20 feet of the boat, you reel it back in, you burn it back in, and throw it back out there. When these fish are really cold like they are right now, as you get it closer to the boat, what you're going to find is when you're lifting it up, it takes longer for that bait to pendulum back and find bottom. And sometimes you'll catch a lot of your fish real close to the boat. And what I think may be happening is those fish are following, and the farther you cast it out, the quicker it's coming back and hitting the bottom. But as it gets closer to the boat and those fish are slowly following behind, it gives them just a little extra time. And right at the very end, it gives them that extra little second where they're like, maybe I will take it. So they eat it. A lot of fish that I catch are probably within 15, 20 feet of the boat when using this technique. Now, locations to find bass for using this technique, I would say the vast majority of the bass when you're in upper 30, lower 40 degree water are going to be around their wintering holes. And for the most part, wintering holes on Mille Lacs Lake are going to be 20 feet or more. You're going to find a lot of fish at the ends of points or on steeper rocky breaks. Usually around a cluster of rocks. It doesn't mean it's the largest boulders that they're looking for necessarily, but they want to be around a cluster of rocks. Some of my favorite areas are going to be rock sand transitions, where you have an isolated area of rocks at the end of a point that's kind of surrounded by more of a sandy bottom. Those are ideal. Those are my favorites, but it doesn't have to be quite that. I would say anywhere where you can find isolated rocks that are somewhat close to a spawning area, or maybe just a little bit off a long tapering point out deeper in that 20 plus foot of water range. That's where you're going to find a lot of fish, especially right away at the beginning, even when there's still a little bit of ice on the lake. Those fish are staying deep. They need some heat before they start moving up. They don't just move up overnight once the ice goes off. So staying deep, that's where you're going to find the majority of fish. There are some exceptions to this. You know, there are isolated schools that may live in bays or on super large reefs that cover a vast area. They might not go all the way out off the edge of the reef and out into the deep water. Sometimes they just find the deepest water that's in that area. So if it's in a bay, they might just be on the little rock pile that's in the bay in the deeper water. If they're on a huge reef, they might be on a little rock pile that's on a depression. So keep that in mind too. That gives you some other spots to check out and try. A lot of times when you find fish shallower, they're going to be receiving a little more sunlight. Those fish are going to be warmer than the fish that are out in deeper water, so they may be more aggressive. There's not as many of them, but when you find them, a lot of times on a nice sunny day, those fish will be a little more willing to bite. If you're looking to get out early in the spring or late in the fall on Mille Lacs Lake, you know, right before ice off or right before freeze up, the blade bait is a must-have on your deck. It's one of those things that just produces fish when a lot of other techniques simply won't do it. I hope these tips help you out, and good luck fishing.